Welcome to the Red Gauge Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle. This is Josh. Today we're joined by a friend of the show, Tim Suchomel. No, did I mess that up? I didn't do that right. Suchomel. There we go. I got it.
There you go.
Yeah. Tim's an associate professor at University of Pittsburgh. He runs the Sports Science Master's program there. He's worked at the Olympic Training Site in Tennessee, and he's got a new book coming out, which I am so excited about getting my copy. It's going to be like Christmas for me. I'm going to peel it open and do nothing else. I'm just going to call in sick and lay in the bathtub where my kids can't find me and read a book. So I'm really looking forward to it. Welcome back, Tim.
I appreciate it. I hope you find some other things to do besides stare at that thing. I know. Having read through it enough, rereading and editing and everything. Eventually, I told my editor that I've been working with, I was like, "Do I really have to read this again?" No, I mean, I appreciate it, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to come on and talk about it.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I gotta plug a little bit. You often run into people who have like different philosophies about training, and a lot of people are like, don't worry about the studies, just go in and work really hard. And I don't think that that's terrible advice most of the time for most people, but I've long been of the opinion that getting stronger or getting faster or performing better at your sport is just all about solving problems. And the more problems you can solve, the further you can go. And so when you have somebody who works really hard to put together a bunch of tools for you, and you can say like, okay, well, the wrench didn't work, maybe it's the hammer, I think that's a really valuable thing to have in your tool set, because I've been doing this a long time, and the number of people that I've met in real life who have been doing it for as long as me or longer is almost zero. It's 2 or 3 people who have stayed in training for 10 or 20 years or whatever. A lot of people come into it and fall back out. And so I think this is this kind of work is a really important step in, keeping people engaged in the process and improving the quality of training and moving people forward. So
yeah, most people even if they may have been in the fitness industry, right? Like, so I've been in the fitness industry for quite a bit of time, but I did not train that whole time.
So I'm excited about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to practice what you preach. I mean, my big thing is anything that we've researched before. I usually serve as my guinea pig or my own guinea pig for everything I do. So, and it was the same exact way when I was still coaching a variety of teams at my last job, where things that I would do. I would first kind of do to myself so I knew what my athletes were going to feel. And then that's kind of one thing that I preach to my students all the time is that, if you don't know how this feels or how it, the stimulus and whatnot is actually going to do to you, then you have no business prescribing it. You don't know enough about it. Now, that being said, if you're in a situation that you cannot do that type of training, but enough people and you have enough resources to be able to kind of understand what it's going to do for you or what it can do for you, how sore it may make you, the benefits, the limitations of everything, then yeah, you have business obviously prescribing it, but you just have to, the intricacies of it is kind of really what you have to focus in on. How do you adjust it? Do you do it for everybody? Is it, it comes down to individualization at that point. I know that we're going to talk about a variety of these things, but the reality is that we have access to a toolbox, and it's never one thing. It is what works best when.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It depends is always the addendum for whatever, like you read a study, you read a workout, you get programming from somebody. It always comes with that little caveat at the bottom of, it depends on where you're at right now.
Right. That's why I said that a toolbox is great, right? Because there's some things that are going to work, and then sometimes, whether it's just where you are at in your time, right? Yep. We have different histories, but then just the different people. Like, you should probably just always be pushing the boundaries of your knowledge.
Yeah.
Just in case you get somebody that's outside your comfort zone, you could actually help them.
Yeah. And there's a lot of training modalities that are kind of like they're sexy, I think, because they're simple. So like if you go ultra high volume or ultra high frequency or ultra high intensity or ultra high specificity, like it's real easy to tell yourself like, oh yeah, you have to find all these tools in the background and it's easy to explain and it's easy to adapt. But the kind of, when you do those strategies that are super, super specific like that, they frequently, maybe they'll work for you really well for a short period of time, and then you'll try to grind that gear for the rest of your career thinking like, hey, this ultra high frequency thing got me 100 pounds. I'm going to keep doing it. And then you end up 10 years later, at the same spot.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard it often where, everything works until it doesn't.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really great to have resources. It's really great to have people. It's really great to have just formats like this where people can talk about stuff, because the more that you can exchange those ideas and the more you can hear different people talk about them, the easier it's going to be to make changes when it's important for you. So
absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, should we get into it? I think we were in doing chapter 6 last time. So yeah, if you're this is the first time that you're turning into the show, if you go to Tim Suchomel Part 1, you get the first 5 or 6 chapters, and so hopefully we can go through the last. There's 11. It was 12 in the book.
12 chapters. Yep.
12 chapters, and I think we finished 6. So should we?
Episode 12.
Episode 12.
Yeah.
Should we start?
No, yeah, I'll just give a brief recap, for that way people
book title, just in case somebody doesn't.
Sure. Yeah, the book title is Science and Development of Muscular Strength. It's going to be published by Human Kinetics, and I believe the release date is July 3rd, if I'm not mistaken. So it's coming soon.
Yeah. We'll put the link in the show notes and everything, so it'll be there.
Yep, and I know it is available for pre-order through Amazon. I know it's not Human Kinetics doesn't do pre-orders, but they advertise the Amazon link because I know that it's there. So, but yeah, for those listening, like we talked about, the previous chapters, we talk about kind of providing the definition of strength. And the definition that we use throughout the book is the ability to produce force against an external resistance in a task-specific context. So briefly, that's just mainly talking about that you can express strength many different ways, and it all comes down to your ability to produce force within a given task. Therefore, there is a magnitude of force, there is a rate of force, and there is a duration over which someone applies force. The second chapter breaks down the adaptations to different methods of training in terms of the neuromuscular system. We talk about the general adaptation syndrome, fitness fatigue paradigm. We talk about some detraining, external stressors. Chapter 3 focuses on the mechanisms of strength. So this gets into the genetics and epigenetics, fiber type, neuromuscular factors, neuroendocrine, the motor learning and skill acquisition side of things. Chapter 4 talks about the training principles. So specifically, we focus on overload, specificity, variation, reversibility, as well as individualization. But then we also talk about the organization of training. So this is where we talk about periodization and different methods that you can use for periodization purposes. And then chapter 5, before we get into all of our new stuff, is an entire chapter based on a spectrum of training methods. So this includes everything from body weight exercises and calisthenics to machines, plyos, unilateral and bilateral exercises, weightlifting movements and their derivatives. We talk about some different eccentric training methods that are in there. But then we also talk about blood flow restriction, sprinting, change of direction. I know I'm forgetting a bunch of them, but it's a dense chapter. I will say that there's a lot of different material in there in terms of different methods that people can use, and the benefits, limitations, and kind of how developing strength characteristics from all of those can come about. So chapter 6, which I believe is where we left off, we were talking about the training methods in chapter 5. This chapter 6 focuses on advanced training methods. So we're qualifying advanced training methods based on those that are, I'll just say, variations of probably traditional training methods like your squats, your benches, or squat presses, pulls, but we're adding a twist to it. So research seems to support that stronger individuals from a relative standpoint potentiate more, and they potentiate faster. So one of the big things we talk about in chapter 6 is potentiation complexes. So for those that are unfamiliar, this is pairing two biomechanically similar exercises. So the most common example is like a back squat and a counter movement jump. That's probably the most common in the literature, but there's bench presses and bench press throws, but then we look at things from the opposite side of things and doing things like plyos before body weight exercises, or plyos before even a strength-based exercise. So, we kind of talk about the complex and contrast training within there, which is, unique. But then another aspect that we talk about is variable resistance training. So this is with chains and bands. And again, we're qualifying this as certainly an advanced method of training, not only because you are changing the resistance throughout, but it does require the motor capacity to be able to have stability in technique. So obviously it would make sense that someone needs to have stable technique before you add in additional variability to the movement, hence variable resistance. But also there is literature to suggest that there is some potentiation-like effects with variable resistance training. So now you're kind of adding an additional layer to potentiation complexes. So not only are you trying to enhance that subsequent performance, but you're doing it in a way where the load that you're using within it is not going to be the same throughout the entire movement. But then lastly, we talk about accentuated eccentric loading with weight releasers and or using like dumbbell jumps where you drop the dumbbells. So the big thing with AEL is to make sure that there's three different components. The eccentric load has to be heavier than the concentric load. They have to pair the eccentric and concentric movements, and it has to result in minimal disruption to the actual movement mechanics of the movement itself. So probably, again, the most common are going to be your squat variations and your bench. But imagine going down with weight releasers on the outside, where you go down to just above your lowest depth. The weight releasers will hit, and a certain percentage will fall off, and then you're standing up with a lighter weight. So that again is advanced in the sense that there's also there's variable resistance in it, but it's very a shock to the system. It happens immediately. And that resistance doesn't come back unless you were to put the weight releasers back on again.
You've just got to really
I can tell you plenty of stories about that. But the whole idea as well is that you have a within potentiations or within set potentiation. So you're benefiting, you're adding that eccentric stimulus to benefit the concentric stimulus within a single rep.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the weight releases. We talked about that a little bit, our first experiences with weight releasers and dumb things that I've done in the weight room. It's a pretty fun experience. But I did want to, one of the things that we didn't get into the last time, potentiation is the thing that like you don't hear a lot in the space. Like people don't talk about it a lot. It will be a thing. I'm sure that in the next 5 years it'll be a normal part of the space. Just like when I was a kid starting lifting weights, people didn't really talk a lot about volume and frequency and those kind of, it was really just like set and rep schemes, and it was all those other principles just in disguise, right? But we've gotten a lot better about naming the things for what they are. But I did want to circle back to talk about doing plyos first, and I wanted to ask a little bit if you know about any research about that specific to like age, because that's one of the things I've noticed. I'm 40 now, and one of the things I've noticed about training is I can still get a lot stronger and I can still get a lot faster. Like I haven't really experienced any age-related decline in my response to training. but
You have wood to knock on?
yeah. But my fitness decays much faster. So if I miss workouts, I get sore sooner, or my ability to perform goes down. And then the other thing that I've noticed is that like doing a little bit of like fast stuff before I lift weights makes me feel like I'm 16 again. Like it makes the weights comfortable. It makes me feel more explosive. It makes me feel stronger. And so I was just curious if I know that it already has that effect. Like that's a big part of the reason why we structure training the way we do, where you do your skill stuff and then your speed stuff and then your power stuff and then your heavy stuff, right? Because you get the most bang for your buck out of each one of those as you're fresher, and you can do the later ones and still have them be really productive further in the workouts and stuff. But I just wanted to like circle back to that a little bit and talk about, have we done that research on, older lifters, or is that maybe just a function of the fact that I've been doing it for 20 years? I fall in that advanced lifter group or something?
You might fall in that advanced lifter group, and just the experience of being able to do it. I mean, the couple studies that come to mind showing that plyometrics can actually I think and the studies that I'm thinking of we're doing things like drop jumps before doing back squats.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them actually show that you can enhance maximal strength acutely. But obviously, if you were to do that chronically, you may be able to benefit, maximal strength long term. The age groups that I remember correctly, these were adults. They weren't kids. But I would imagine that they were probably 25 and younger.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would imagine getting 40 or above, you're aging yourself out of even in most
exercise science,
just athletics,
until you get to like 60 again.
Right. Like it's pretty niche. So you got like professors that they got to get the most bang for their buck. So it's like, all right, I'm going to do 55-year-olds that are getting back into powerlifting, and we're going to put them on plyometrics. Like, that's pretty fucking specific. Like,
well, I mean, to your point, I would say I think every study that I've done, the age group range that I've had is 18 to 35. Mm-hmm. And the reason why is, as we were talking about, that's typically the age range from athletics that we are using a lot of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not to say that you can't use them outside of that age range. But that's where the bulk of the research, I mean, you're basically looking at a bell curve in terms of the age groups that you're looking at. But, mm-hmm. The bell curve probably ends, again, I don't know this for sure, but I can't say you're getting a lot of research up in, 80-year-old individuals.
Right.
Even 70-year-old individuals. So that being said, you're 18 to 35. That's kind of the money spot right there in terms of where the research comes from. But mm-hmm. going back to the plyos, obviously the benefit that you get from doing something like that, even if you would say that you are acutely enhancing the stiffness and the transmission of force within your muscles, that's essentially what where that potentiation probably comes from.
Right. Yeah. It's been it's been a really interesting ride, because I still have again great times in the weight room, but then I'm often surprised that I feel like I have to like trick my nervous system into realizing that I'm supposed to go fast. I'm like, it'll still do it, but it seems like it's lazy and it doesn't want to. I'm like, come on, man, wake up, we got squats to do. Yeah, cool. Okay, so you talked a little bit about these being advanced procedures and about the the technical necessity. Like, it's a ton of fun. We talked last time about how much it's a lot of fun to lift with chains. Like, it's a cool sound, it's a fun effect, it's a really enjoyable experience. It is important that you can do it technically, but we just had Danny Myers-Glynn on, and I really wanted to ask her about this, and I forgot when we were in the show, but she mentioned that like her first bench shirt meet, she bench pressed like 60 pounds, and I was just thinking about how I've seen bench shirts before that with 60 pounds you wouldn't even be able to get the bar to your chest.
I thought the same thing.
Yeah. And so do you have any guidelines for people for like when it's appropriate to start looking at using these kinds of assistive devices and stuff? Like, obviously we want to go to where we feel like we're pretty smooth in the lifts and we can reproduce it, and our first time we touch the bar looks a lot like our last time touching the bar. And I've even told people before, like, wait until you've worked through like a couple shoulder aches and pains, because they're going to come as part of your training career, and they're usually a good indicator that you're doing something that's not what you should be doing. And so those are kind of things like I've talked about. Do you have any other guidance for people if they're thinking about, like, it's time for me to bust out the chains and the squat suits or whatever?
Well, I would say the big thing with chains is the understanding that you're actually not necessarily training as well as it could be, training the weakest part of the lift.
Mm-hmm.
The reason why we use chains and bands is we're obviously trying to enhance the rate of force development on the way up, because we're adding resistance on our way up. Some people will do the reverse bands and whatnot, and that's training something a little bit different. But what I try to tell people is that, look, if you need to have 80-90% at the bottom of your squat, and you have 80-90% between the chains and the actual weight on the bar, you're not squatting 90% at the bottom. So you're actually, I'm not going to say you're confusing your body, but you obviously know what it feels like at the top, but at the bottom, you haven't actually trained that heavy load yet. Mm-hmm. So, I would say that your maximal strength block is still going to have no chains and no bands, because you're still focused on what that bottom needs to feel like, and to experience what it feels like coming out of the hole. But when you're adding in chains and bands, it's more for the speed component coming out of there than anything else. Yeah. Obviously, the percentage that you add on top of that, you can run into a brick wall really quickly, but because you have the mechanical advantage in different positions, you're able to get out of there. So, we talk about stick points, and the stick point is that's why some people will use chains and bands, is that you want to be able to come out of there with a little bit of speed and then hit that stick point with that heavier load, or the chains or bands, whatever you're using. And that's why some people will use it. But I would also say that from a guideline standpoint, there's some research to support the idea that 30% of the total load, like 25 to 30%, may be the chains and bands weight. And it varies based on the lift. Like, some of them are, the bench press, the deadlift, the squat. Now, again, I would challenge people that if you've done it with a back squat, try to do it with a front squat, because it changes everything.
Yeah. Yeah, and each one of those lifts, like, you learn as you do it for a while what feels hard. Like, maybe it feels hard, like bench press, like, it's usually off the chest or at the lockout. But you'll find out as you do it over the years that it's variable. Like, it might be one thing for you and another thing for a buddy, or across your career it might be like, oh man, if I could get it off the chest, I could do it, or if I could get it past this lockout, I could do it, or whatever, So when you start experimenting with bands and chains, like, you might find that it takes a little fine tuning to get it to the point where it really matches what you need,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it's probably utilized more inappropriately, because bands, like, I'm thinking of our weight room, like, we don't have like a ton of types of bands, right? We got like really weak ones, and then some that are like
500 pounds.
Yeah, it's unrealistic for anybody. Or, like, I think back of our chains back in the day, like, I don't even know if they were the same amount of links, you know what I'm saying? Like, some sizes. So, like, there are probably a lot of people that do that, or like, oh, I'm going to do a chain set or band, and it's like, you're not really. We should probably be a little bit more intelligent, but maybe they're just getting a little bit the excitement. Like, I'm not even saying that it's bad, but it might not be as good as it could be.
No, I would 100% say, like, if you're super burnt out on the weight room and you're having a hard time getting in there, try some chains.
Yeah.
Like, just go have fun for a little bit. Like, it's a good time.
I'll use
and that's one thing with this chapter is, we try to highlight it at the end of the chapter, and all of these can be used by a variety of populations, but you're going to get more out of them if you've already developed that baseline level of strength and technique stability but also if you are able to introduce them as a novel training stimulus later. Because if you take an individual and you throw them into potentiation complexes, chains and bands, weight releasers, and their training age is like 2 years, you can't use that later. And it's not going to have the same, well, I mean, you can use it later, but you're not going to have the same effect as if you were to develop that foundation of doing the basics savagely well and then introducing it later when they've kind of hit their ceiling from your traditional training.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like with the bands, sometimes I just use it to lighten up the bottoms, just to when I'm trying to teach like acceleration out of the hole, especially in a squat. Like it just allows them to, for some reason, if it's just weight on the back, even if I lighten it up, they just move at regular speed. Whereas by making the light, like it's almost like a brain thing, like it's getting lighter as I'm coming down. So like they think, okay, like, oh, I can move this. Whereas if it's just the same weight, it doesn't seem to work. So that's a lot of time I just use that just to try to develop the thoughts of getting acceleration out of the hole. Because lots of kids don't naturally squat that, right? They stay at like one normal pace and they don't understand like it might be the difference of you just coming out of that hole.
Yeah. Well, and I think like
explosively.
there's like a little, that's another one of those tags, like the it depends tags, right? I think, what you are talking about, what Tim's talking about are kind of different things. Like I think in Tim's sense, it's kind of like a 6-week block of bands and chains. And you're talking about like an intervention for a workout or two, right? And so those are going to have different impacts in terms of like the future of the athlete, right? Yeah. All right. Can we get into chapter 7?
We can get into chapter 7. Chapter 7 is trying to wrap a number of these methods into the program design piece. So, so it's focused on program design. We break down the needs analysis in terms of the athlete as well as the needs of that athlete. Specifically, we start talking about some other programming variables here, but also we factor in training age, the training year, but also factor in the overall training approach. So we revisit some of those concepts of periodization and kind of planning that out for the individual, focused on different strength characteristics. So, as we talked about, maximal strength versus reactive strength, these are all different things. But you could throw the word strength in any phase, and you're essentially working on those strength characteristics. You're just expressing force differently. So, whether if you're focused on a higher volume phase of training, for example, strength endurance, and building that work capacity, and being able to do this over the course of different phases throughout the year is kind of allowing the individual to develop certain characteristics at certain periods of time. It's kind of like the discussion that we had the last time, asking the football coach, when does your athlete have to be powerful? Well, they have to be powerful all the time. Not physiologically possible. So we want to have them the most powerful at this time. So lining that up and providing programming tactics to allow them to do that in a phasic method, that's really what we're talking about in program design.
Yeah. So we should unpack some of those things real quick for people so that it's a little easier to understand. So when we're looking at what we can do in the weight room, right? We kind of talked last time about we can change tissues or we can make you better at something, right? Like kind of roughly speaking. So when you're looking at the program design from a strength context, right? If you are training a shot putter, then maybe this looks like in your out of season, it's about like hypertrophy and strength, and then in season, it's about strength and power, right? So the exercise selection stuff changes. So when we say a phasic design, that's kind of what we're talking about, right? That we're moving those exercises around and stuff.
Right. So yeah, the programming variables, kind of thinking about if we go back to like the bigger training variables of overload, specificity, etc., that still comes down to exercise choice, but also we get into things like exercise order, We talk about, what we would term power-based exercises and volume, intensity, and kind of the I don't want to use the term optimal load, but what load do we need for the characteristics that we're trying to build? Because I think oftentimes when people want to manipulate a training variable, they automatically go back to volume, when in reality, the intensity is going to drive the adaptation that we're trying to get. More, obviously more volume is going to cause a certain adaptation, but less volume is also going to cause a certain adaptation as well. So, another factor to consider with this is kind of the question of, of hypertrophy. And I know that this book is focused on strength, obviously, but if I'm designing a program that's based on hypertrophy to lay the foundation for strength, does it make sense to do 3 sets of 10 or 10 sets of 3?
Right.
So that's one thing that we'll talk about in terms of like the higher intensity lays the foundation for strength to a greater extent. It also kind of focuses again on that, those type 2 fibers that are going to help, the higher magnitudes and rates of force development that we're looking for.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's always a really interesting because like again, going back in the time machine to when I was a kid, right? It was like the advice was, if you want to get stronger, it's like 1s to 5s, and if you want to get bigger, it's 12s and 15s. And we know now a little better that it seems like if you can get within a couple reps of failure, anywhere from like 5 to 30 will do the squeeze for getting bigger. But if you really want strength gains, you still got to do heavy stuff.
Yeah, I mean, the classic adage is if you want to get strong, you're eventually going to have to lift heavy. But that I would also challenge that a little bit, as you do, to say, well, what is strong? If we're talking about maximal 1 RM strength, 100%. But at the same exact time, if we're talking about the expression of force different ways, then it may not always pay to lift heavy stuff all the time.
So when we get into that needs analysis, like in the context of this, where we're talking about strength, what are the categories? How do you break that up to describe? Like obviously, if we have different positions, different things are different sports, right? Different things are going to be more or less valuable. So it's easy to think about in terms of like there's like power, like a direct drive sense, where it's like not a super elastic endeavor, and then there's ones where there's a stretch shorten cycle involved, and then there's maximal force production and all those kind of things. So how do you categorize the different things when you're talking about the needs analysis?
I'd say the 2 big categories are going to be the athlete and the sport/event. What do the characteristics of the athlete, what do they actually have, and what do they need? Obviously, when we talk about the sport, that's when you're going to break down the movement analysis, energy systems, the duration over which they have to complete some of these things. Because if you think about a sprinter, an elite sprinter is only on the ground for about 90 milliseconds every single step,
right.
At max velocity. So that being said, if you're not going to have a sprinter who's on the ground for 120 milliseconds, because that's an eternity. It may still be fast, but that's an eternity compared to everyone else. So those types of things. And then the athlete, again, do they need to be big? Do they need to be, lean? Do they, it's kind of like if you go back to linemen, if we talk about offensive linemen, their job is to, again, block for the quarterback, but that's done in different ways. Your center is doing something different than what your ends are doing and your tackles are doing. So, that being said, these individuals need to be big, but they need to be able to withstand something that's running at them in different planes. Because, I'm not even going to try a lot of the football terminology because that I never I never got into playing tackle football far into my career. But that being said, the needs of every single position in football is really unique in terms of what what makes them successful. You wouldn't train a lineman the same way you train a skill player. The skill player has to be fast, agile. It's not to say that the lineman doesn't have to be agile, but they have to probably be, this is weird to say, less agile than your skill players.
Sure.
Yeah.
But that's pretty much the breakdown. You have your athlete characteristics, you have your sport and event characteristics, but some of that is also going to get into the beyond the movements themselves. What planes of motion and everything are they actually working in? If I take a diver, for example, it's pretty much one plane while they are jumping off of the platform or the diving board, but obviously they are spinning in midair. Now, what's unique about all that is they're spinning in midair, but they are, internally producing force. Externally, they're not touching anything. So they're not necessarily producing force against anything else except maybe the air. But being able to manipulate your body in space is something that they need to be able to do. If you think about the sport of weightlifting, Lasha Talaghatsi, debatably one of the best weightlifters ever. You got a guy who's 180 kilos, snatching 225 kilos. I mean, that's a large man. I don't care what anyone says. That's a large man. And being able to manipulate your body to get, the bar's got to go a long ways. He's not a short guy.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different when you have every single lever working for you, when you have, the little, for men, the 60 kilo weightlifters that, have the really short arms, and, maybe they're a smidge over 5 feet tall, and, the bar doesn't have to move very far. Well, that's mechanical advantage, but the lift is still the same. And so the needs and the demands of every single sport is very unique. And that, we tackle that a little bit in terms of strength characteristics in this chapter.
Yeah. This is kind of throwing it back a chapter, but when we were talking about doing, when you talk about variety, we had Logan Chapman on, who was a 2,300 pound totaler in powerlifting, massively strong person. And I asked him, I was like, how far away from a competition back squat do you get? And it was like high bar, like he stuck pretty close to the, pause squats, whatever, but there wasn't a tremendous amount of variety. So when we talk about variety to athletes, how much do we need to stay close to whatever it is that we're doing to get the benefit out of it,
You can get incredibly fine with your programming, but oftentimes what I've found is you really don't have to. Especially when you have really younger athletes, you can add a lot more variety because it's really just about developing movement patterns and making sure that they are positionally strong. So the debate that we still have time and time again is the back squat versus the front squat. And again, I would, if you really want to get fine detail with it, I would make the argument that it's more beneficial for sprinters to back squat than it is for them to front squat. And part of the reason for that is where the activation of the muscles are actually going to be. So if you think about, there's certainly more distal quad activation during a front squat than there is for a back squat. It's not to say that there isn't activation, but one of the things that you're going to find is that it benefits sprinters to have more mass proximally in their thighs than it will distally, and it's because of how high they have to lift their knees when they're doing their knee drive for sprinting. If you have more mass distally, that's going to be heavier, and then you have to be able to manipulate your body doing that. Now, it's crazy me saying that, but if you look at some of the sprinters, their legs are huge. But at the same exact time, you go look at Usain Bolt. Usain Bolt doesn't have much of a distal quad. It's still lean, don't get me wrong, but if you look at his proximal thighs, they're bigger than they are distally. Switch gears. If you go look to a track cyclist, their distal quads are massive. I mean, your VMOs are covering your patella at that point.
No kneecaps.
Yeah, exactly. But if you think about what they have to do, their sport is all about that distal extension and getting through those high gears. And it's kind of interesting. If you go, there's always podium pictures of all them standing there, and all their legs distally are just massive.
Yeah, and I would imagine too that, there's like obviously when you cycle, you probably are exercising the same amount or the most force at the top. You'd be the least amount of force when the lever's straight out.
Extended.
Yeah, whatever. Anyway, you're doing a huge amount of force when you're in, extreme flexion, right, at the smallest angles, and then as a sprinter, you're doing the most force at the most open angles, right? So, like with a squat, there's more of that hip hinge action than a front squat, and so that's kind of would maybe translate better to that horizontal drive, I think.
I mean, and if you really think about it, like the answers have been there, right? Because bodybuilders have known that for a long time. Like not necessarily front squat to back squat, but going high bar to low bar, right? A high bar squat's going to mimic a little bit more of a front squat upright position and do exactly right. High bar, they say, to target the distal part of the quads.
Yeah.
And a low bar, which is going to have way more hip hinge, is going to get the thigh and the glutes and the hamstrings better, right?
Yeah.
So like that was there. It's not that big of a leap to go like, oh, yeah, that probably is also benefiting if you're right sprinting. So, and I feel like I hear a lot of people talk about that now, but as a high school level strength coach, I'm often defending these kind of positions to people that are just like, man, that's stupid. That's all made up. And I'm like, I promise you, I promise you that, like, I'm not wrong. I'm not making it up. Like, I promise you that. And it just still, maybe it's just we live too far away from a big city. We haven't got that knowledge out here, but
maybe.
And it's interesting.
Yeah.
It's
well,
new.
and again, it's not. Oftentimes, it's not a this or that. It's when, just for added variety. My when I was working with the volleyball team at Carroll, anytime we'd go back into a higher volume block, we're back squatting twice a week. We weren't front squatting because doing front squats for sets of 10s is miserable.
It's the best.
Oh yeah. But again, that comes back to what we were talking about before is I had done that before, and I was like, I really don't want their wrists and their shoulders and everything to feel like this. And especially when I'm teaching individuals that to continue to add weight to the bar, the last thing I want to do is when they get tired that they lose their core and they start to drop their elbows and add more stress to their back. So, in this case, a high bar back squat seemed to be the better alternative for us because the load was heavy enough to get the stimulus that we wanted, but it wasn't too heavy to the point that we were breaking technique and we were turning a back squat into a good morning.
Right.
So you brought up a good thing. So there's lots of lifts that other things fail before, right? Like say a bent row, like you could use back or you could use lifting straps because your grip is probably going to fail before your back. So for front squats, if somebody is having fatigue issues, let's say in the core, I have a lot of kids when we do front squats, their legs are going fine. They just can't stay upright anymore. Their elbows drop, so they dump it. So would you say that they just need to stay lighter weight and work on that core portion? Or would it be beneficial for maybe some of their top sets to use any sort of apparatus? Like Rogue has a bar that you can adjust at the transformer bar, I think is what it's called. So it's a back squat, but the weight is front loaded. I usually will just give the kids these small towels and we wrap it around so the kid doesn't have to be here. They're just holding a towel upright. That usually helps them a little bit. But I actually don't know. I do that because I've got to get 70 kids through a workout, so I can't really do one-on-one adjustments. But would it be better for me to just make them back off weight and get that core strength. I guess it depends on what I'm trying to get out of the lift is really the answer.
Yeah, I think you answered your own question.
Talking out loud's good, guys.
Yeah. I mean, we dance around an answer long enough, we'll find it, right? But no, I think it comes down to the individual as well, because you can get some people's cores who are just crazy strong, and they're not going to fail there, but it very well could be another joint. Eventually, me personally anyway, my wrists start to feel it. I don't have the greatest wrist flexibility in the grand scheme of things, but my legs are challenging, or become challenged at the end of something really heavy like that as well. But the accumulation of fatigue with those higher volume sets as well will get you eventually. I tell people mental toughness is doing like 5 sets of 10.
Yeah, absolutely. I've told the story before, but the worst thing I've ever done to myself was I did 15 sets of 15 on squats with 315 and a minute strict rest. So every minute I was going down again. And I was going through knee issues, and I was just trying to find ways to make light weights good work. And man, this is actually a question I have for you. I don't know if now's the time to get into it, but I got towards the end of those sets, and I started like time traveling. My ancestors were coming to see me, and we had Alana Carson's on, who was the women's NAI marathon champ just a couple like this week, and she was talking about finishing that marathon. She had that same experience. She's like, there's ghosts running next to me, and like really getting in the hole. Is there any research on like when you put people in that state, like why do we think that happens, where you start to like dissociate a little bit and you don't really understand the world around you? Has anybody looked at that?
If they have, that's out of the realm of the research that I'm looking at. But I just, a quick story for me was, I used to do a lot of distance running previously, and during the marathon that I ran, I could have told you that I saw the banner of mile 21 twice.
Yeah.
So
time travel. It happens.
Yeah, exactly. You probably, I mean, it's a state of delirium, really. I'm sure that you are not the only one to experience that, and the only thing that I can see being an issue is trying to get that through the ethics board for approval.
We're gonna give
exercised induced delirium.
We might give all our athletes rhabdo, but I was just talking to my brother about it last night, and I was saying the only thing I could think of is like your brain is like like panically realizing that you can't continue to do this and trying to like find a solution somehow. Like what is the alternative that I could feed you that would get you to stop doing whatever it is that you're doing at this moment?
Yeah, and most people it's going to make them stop too.
Yeah.
Like that, we just did some rep maxing. It's kind of getting close to mid try, so we did a little bit of rep maxing at the end of some heavy sets, and the kids would throw on weight, and it's like, I'm looking at it, it's like, you're going to be able to do this for like 14 in squats.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, just go up weight. I know you want to impress everybody, like 13, 14, but you're not going to want to do that, man. Like, just pick something you could do for 8, or you know what I mean? Like, I don't want it to be for 3, because I did want them to challenge themselves, but it's like, you're probably just going to give up before. And I think some did really well. I was impressed that they were able to push themselves, but I know for one, just how easy whatever the 12th one was, and then failing 13, I was like, okay, you just gave up.
Yeah,
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I would have too.
3:35 for 12 is a lot. Right? So
yeah. I have a good story about failing on front squats that I just thought I'd share. When I was young, I herniated a disc in my back, and I was really messed up for a long time. I had some like partial paralysis and numbness and all kinds of stuff in my leg. It was not a good time. But I realized after a few months that I couldn't just not work out, because I was getting like just fat and super depressed and not happy with my life. And so I started going back to the gym again, and it was a really interesting experience. I remember 2 things that happened really, really, really vividly. One was the first time I went back, it was Monday, so it was International Bench Press Day, and I couldn't pick up a 45-pound plate, so I was just loading 10s on, and I just had like 10s stacked out, forever. And I remember when I left, it was like the gloomiest, most disgusting overcast day ever, but I felt like it was just like a Technicolor daydream because it was the first time I'd had any endorphins or joy in my life in like 9 months. But I did a front squat workout. I realized I couldn't do back squats and I couldn't do deadlift for a while, and so I was doing front squats, and I'd gotten really, really attached to my weightlifting belt, and I would wear it for everything. I mean, I'd wear it when I was loading a bar. I mean, I was just like, I was living in that thing, just hoping to God that I didn't have another problem. And I was doing the warm-ups one day for a front squat workout, and I got up to like, my last warm-up was like 315 or 365 or something, and I forgot to wear my belt, and I sat down and stood up, and it was literally that whole set of musculature, like 360 degrees, was just on fire. Like I had never used it in my entire life. It was a pretty horrific experience, but
just let your core.
Yeah, you get real dependent on belts if you use them all the time. Cool. Okay. Huh?
Yeah.
8
belts are okay.
Yeah,
they're appropriate at some points, but you should probably not rely on
don't live in them.
A muscle belt around your body.
Yeah. If you feel like you need to live in it, go see a PT.
Yeah, that's probably good.
Agreed.
So chapter 8.
Chapter 8 is on concurrent training. So one of the things that a lot of athletes do is some mode of conditioning in addition to obviously strength training. So we wanted to make sure I touched on that. So this chapter focuses on various conditioning methods, from long slow distance to HIIT training to maximal aerobic speed, but also mentioning the addition of sprint training. Your traditional conditioning methods, a lot of people think like, we're just going to go out and we're just going to run, miles and miles and miles, when in reality, there is a spectrum that individuals are going to use. And so we touch on kind of the benefits of using certain HIIT methods when, at certain times, why sprint training may be more beneficial for those intermittent athletes rather than running distance all the time. But a lot of this comes back to the idea of whether or not there is this interference effect in terms of, is this conditioning going to impact my strength characteristics, and is my strength training going to impact my conditioning? There's more consensus now than what there was, but generally speaking, depending on how you lay it out, and we go through different programming considerations of the order of them, the intensity of certain things, the duration of the different methods. But in the grand scheme of things, an individual, an athlete, can benefit both strength and their conditioning depending on what they're doing. Mm-hmm. But again, this comes back to something we just talked about, is making it specific to the individual. The example that I use with my students all the time is I ask them the question: is soccer an endurance sport, or is it an anaerobic sport, or a strength power sport? And oftentimes I'll get the answer, well, it's an endurance sport because it lasts 90 minutes, blah, blah, blah. And, at the same time, I'll say, okay, is a shot on goal, is that anaerobic or aerobic? Anaerobic. Is a pass anaerobic or aerobic? Anaerobic. How about, containing the ball? How about sprinting? How about cutting? And they're like, well, these are all anaerobic. And I said, okay, if you watch a midfielder, for example, they run more than anybody, in the entire match. They run more than anybody. But if you watch an outside midfielder, especially when the ball is on the opposite side of the pitch, they're standing. They're walking. You could call that aerobic, but the conditioning methods that have been used historically say, well, you cover 10K or 6.2 miles during the match, therefore you need to go out and run 6.2 miles. Mm-hmm. When in reality, most of that distance is covered at high intensity, in short intermittent bursts, and then you can go look at walking. Obviously, things like Catapult and GPS are able to give us a little more insight on how much they're actually doing that. But what's really interesting is, if you watch the last World Cup final, one of the things they always zoomed in on was Messi. And Messi walks all the time. All the time. It's amazing. But then when he's on the ball, everything is fast.
Uh-huh.
So, and being able to make those split second decisions obviously is going to make or break that. But it comes down to what method do you need and when. Because you may for your soccer athletes, you may be doing some longer duration things farther away from the season, but you still have to be able to expose them to that sprint work as they get closer and even during the season. One of the things there's research to support the idea that you expose the individuals to max velocity at least once a week, so that they can continue to maintain that speed reserve that they've built up. But that's what Chapter 8 focuses on, is the combination of both resistance training and the conditioning aspect.
Yeah, I think that's a really great takeaway, because there's a lot of sports where we aren't actually that critical when we think about what our athletes are doing. Like, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of, like you could do interval training with those soccer players all day, and then when they get on the field, they're going to feel like how they trained. And if you just do slow jogs, they're going to get on the field and they'll be gassed in no time at all, because it doesn't feel the same. It's a very different activity.
Yeah, just actually being critical of what actually happens. I just had this conversation with an athlete where he was talking about, we were talking about basketball, and he said basketball, the whole game we're sprinting up and down the court. And I was like, you sprint the whole game, is just sprinting out up and down. He's like, first off, no one could do that. Right? You'd go up and down and be gassed. But like, I made 5 on 5 go out there, and we just critically thought. It was like, okay, you guys came down, ran a play, like no one was sprinting. Like a couple of people were jogging around, a lot of people were just standing. And it's like having the idea of what the sport is and then what the actual sport is a big difference. Like people don't actually think about it sometimes critically of what is going on, which means they're probably not training for what they should be training for. It's very smart.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about interference effect, because I'm sure that there's people who have heard it before or maybe haven't heard it before and they aren't sure what it is. Can I give my uninformed view, and then you can fix me when I'm wrong?
Sure.
Cool. So the idea with the interference effect is that, there's, I guess I don't know how granular to get with this now that I started talking. The idea with the interference effect is, let's say that you want to squat 700 pounds and run a marathon. If you try to do them at the same time, if you try to train for them both at the same time, you're probably going to have a hard time, because the signaling, like the processes in your body, aren't the same in terms of what you're training for and how your body's going to react to it. And there's only so much stress you can manage in in some period of time. There's the idea that whether you're training for strength or for speed or for endurance, that that by doing one you're going to diminish the other. And I think that there's like, if you are truly training for like extreme endurance, you want to be an ultra marathon guy or a marathon guy, that you're not going to set your lifetime PRs in heavy lifts at the time. Doesn't mean that you can't get any strength increases or make any progress on strength, depending on like where you're at in your training age and all that kind of stuff. I guess that's an important caveat. Milanichev's probably not going to squat 1,000 pounds while he's training for a marathon, but you could still get stronger, but just it'll diminish the efficacy of trying to get bigger or trying to get stronger if you're doing that real extreme endurance stuff. If I feel like in my training career, it's been there's been a big variety. Like people have thought like, 30 or 40 minutes of cardio is fine, and then it's gone all the way down to like you shouldn't do any cardio, and then it seems like it's come back up a little bit where like you can do a moderate amount of low to moderate intensity stuff and it's not really going to affect you at all. And then if you start dialing it up, your strength and power and all that kind of stuff will go down. And then there's also effects like in a workout. So if you do your long jog and then you lift weights, you're probably going to have a little less power. If you lift weights and then do your long jog, you're probably going to run a little less fast. So how do we describe the interference effect? How wrong am I?
No, I think you covered the basis of it. I mean, the interference effect when it comes to concurrent training is looking at it very acutely, in the sense that if I perform a long duration, long distance workout, it's going to impede my ability to maximize my strength adaptations if they are performed too close together. And vice versa, if I am going to lift really heavy and then try to do some sort of conditioning workout, there may be some sort of interference effect, in the sense that maybe I use certain macronutrients that I may not be able to use as effectively when I get into the other type of workout. So, but again, we come back to it depends, because it really does depend on what the workout is. What is it? What's the duration? What's the intensity? And how far apart are the workouts from one another? So one of the things that we talk about in the chapter is that there may not be any interference effect if you separate things, by upwards to 8 hours. So, I mean, if you are doing something in the morning and then you do something in the afternoon, they may not necessarily impact each other, because also during that you would have had time to refuel, you would have had time to rest, but and obviously, your blood pressure and everything comes back down. You're able to kind of get back to equilibrium for a little while, but being able to come back, refueled and ready to go, that's, it's not uncommon for a lot of athletes to be doing 2-a-days, depending on the workouts that they have.
Yeah, and we kind of saw that in like the CrossFit games, right? When people started getting really serious about being a games athlete, they would split their training up, where they would do like their big cardio chunk in the morning, and then several hours later they do a skill session, and then several hours later they do a strength session. And that kind of allows you to work all those components without them being right on top of each other, by giving yourself some space in there.
Yep.
Yeah. How much, like, let's say that you're you're just working out once a day, and you want to be a little stronger and you want to be in a little shape. Let's say maybe you're prioritizing the strength and hypertrophy side of your workouts. Do we have a good idea for about how much, like, obviously, there might be a little period where you kind of got to get in shape for it, and you're not going to count those 6 weeks or whatever, but as a part of a regular prescription, do we have an idea of about how much cardio you can do before you start to see interference, and if you're putting them in one session because that's your jam?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I don't know if I can actually give you an answer on that, just because there's so many variables at play there.
Yeah, I figured that'd probably be the answer.
The episode title of this is going to be "It Depends."
It depends.
You could say you could call this our entire field "It Depends."
Yeah.
Yeah, and
the study of it depends.
Yeah, and it's what makes it fun, because you can keep finding things to be better.
Absolutely.
Cool. Okay. Do you have any questions about concurrent training?
No, I mean, I feel like that was pretty close. Like, obviously there's some things you're just not going to be able to get around, right? Like, so I try to take it back to where I'm at. I could give kids at home workout, and 10% will do it, and that's great for them. But then all of a sudden, like, am I counting that in my programming? And so I'm not, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
so
how do you navigate that volume?
Right. So, like, we can't really necessarily do much, like, splitting up. Yeah. I just, a lot of times it's, especially in the summer, it's like we're in the weight room for an hour, then we're on the field for an hour. Like,
yeah.
I can't be like, all right, high school kids, some of you are freshmen. We live in a gigantic, school district. Like, go home for 4 hours, come back.
Yeah.
It would be great, or go home and fuel up. Like, they don't fuel up, and they're just going to go home and play Fortnite or whatever. So, yeah. What we know is appropriate and what we're actually able to pull off is not always the same thing. So, yeah, let's try to do our best.
So I guess in that light, if you're giving advice to somebody who's planning a program and they've got multiple things that they're trying to work on, the advice I always give, I just got because I was a thrower, right? And so you would throw, and then you would do your speed and power work, and then you do your heavy stuff, right? And that was kind of our things, because it's hard to be technically proficient when you're tired. So you want to do that when you're fresh, right? When you're fresh, you get way more out of the speed and power stuff. And you don't really need those qualities as much to do a really effective squat or deadlift or bench press or, whatever, to be effective in the weight room. So do you have just like a kind of general advice for structuring the the day if you're trying to incorporate those speed or endurance components in with a strength program?
I mean, you really have to consider the intensity of the workouts themselves. So, if I need to have an athlete do sprinting and resistance train, I want to separate those things the best that I can. But, maybe I don't necessarily need a larger volume of sprints to get the impact that I want. In which case, I might be able just to get those out of the way depending on the distance and everything that we're covering. I mean, if we're talking long sprints where they're doing 400s, I mean, that's a completely different story. But if I'm talking about doing short sprints, short intermittent sprints, I may be able to do that as part of an extended warm up and then go lift and do that within kind of that same session. Because at the time, if I'm doing those short intermittent sprints, then my lift may not be as long. It may not have as many lifts in it. And if I'm if I'm crunched for time, I mean, what's more powerful than a max velocity sprint? I may be able to incorporate that, and then I'm going to nix other exercises because I already did what I was looking for in that lift. So the one thing that I try to harp on with the program design piece is we are not taking our conditioning and putting it over here, putting our lifting here, and then putting all our skill work here. It is one big silo. It is not separate silos. So as much as we would love to have athletes do everything we tell them to do, to sleep 8 to 9 hours every single day, to eat exactly at certain times, time out their nutrients and everything, it's just not going to happen, with the vast majority of athletes. So that being said, we just have to be as smart as we can when it comes to designing our programs that are going to incorporate this. So if you have a longer duration or a higher intensity workout that may impede a lifting session, they need to be separated more. Same exact thing. If your lifting session is going to impact your conditioning session for that day, they should be separated. Or at least modified so that you get the most out of what is most important at the time. When I was working with the baseball team at ETSU, we would have situations that the team would be running, like they'd be doing hills at practice, and then they'd come in and their legs would be tired. So one of the things that we'd have to do is nix one of the lifts just to accommodate for the added stress that they already had.
Yeah, that makes sense. When you start making those decisions about like what you're going to cut out and what you're not going to cut out, do you try to look at kind of like what has the biggest stimulus and you want to keep those things, or do you look at what's going to be the least fatigue generating and keep those things, or you balance them? Is it just another it depends conversation?
It is and it isn't, because it I guess it does depend on where we are in the season, or over the course of the training year, because the reality is off season is kind of the time to develop fatigue, because you're trying to develop that work capacity piece, and there's going to be additional fatigue there. Your goal is to manage and mitigate fatigue as we get into the season so that we can still recover and maximize performance when we need to. But I don't know that there's a single answer for doing it, which is why it's the art of program design.
Right. Okay. Dumb question. Why can't I just peak all year?
If you can figure out that answer, no, I'm just kidding. You can't. It's impossible to peak all year round because physiologically we cannot maintain the same performance for long extended blocks. Now, as someone who is untrained, we continue to experience more and more peaks because any added stimulus is going to be beneficial to us, but we cannot maintain that peak because of the accumulated fatigue that it takes. It basically overpowers the recovery stimulus. So this goes back into that fitness fatigue paradigm, where the fitness characteristics are everything that are going to be benefiting our performance. whereas the fatigue characteristics are everything that are going to negatively impact our performance. And the relationship between those two is preparedness. Our preparedness continues to go down and down with the more amount of fatigue that we accumulate if we're not recovering properly. So we can maintain peaks for certain periods of time, but then we also can't maintain peaks for extended periods of time because certain characteristics cannot be maintained or trained to maintain a peak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the mistakes I made when I was real young is I found a bunch of peaks that were written for, like elite athletes who were on steroids. And when I tried to do them, I was like, you're 6 weeks in and you've gotten like as much benefit as I'm going to get out of it. And then at 8 weeks, things start hurting.
It's like
and then
12 to 16
12 to 16 weeks,
peak,
I'm falling apart. And, so it's something I always want to bring up, is like, that preparedness, that kind of general fitness decays when you're in a peak, right? And, your specific stuff goes up, but that it only goes for so long.
Right.
Yeah. All right. What chapter are we in now? 9?
I believe we are in chapter 9, yeah.
10?
9.
No, but
what were we just in?
Yeah, were we just in?
Yeah. We were just in 8.
Oh, we were just in 8. All right, let's do 9.
Chapter 9 is
I don't
measuring.
Want to keep you for 3 hours,
Yeah. Chapter 9 is about measuring strength. So we provide a rationale for why we need to measure certain strength characteristics, but also we go through different testing considerations in terms of reliability, validity, to make sure that we go through tester knowledge to make sure that those individuals who are actually administering the test know what they're actually looking at. But we also talk about the different types of strength testing. So everything from 1RM testing to isometric testing to reactive strength testing, and everything in between. So there's a vast majority of different types of tests that you can use. The other thing we mentioned in there is things like combined assessment methods, where we're looking at things like force velocity profiling and dynamic strength index, eccentric utilization ratio. So we mention all those, but we talk about the timing of testing and how you can get different results. So if you're testing in the off season versus preseason versus in season, kind of what you're actually testing for. But then lastly, we wrap it up with the integration of sports science and using that with evidence-based practice. So this is where you're profiling your athletes and using things like radar plots to understand what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, and where do they need to be. So I will say, of all the chapters within the book, chapter 9 might be the most dense chapter because there is so many different things in it. We talk about squats, we talk about bench pressing, we talk about iso pulls, iso squats, different jumps in terms of counter movement jumps, squat jumps, rebound jumps, drop jumps, the relationship between all those things, predicting 1RM strength and the reliability of all that. So, being able to estimate a 1RM from things like load velocity profiles. So we'll touch on some of that as well. So there's, we try to highlight the benefits and limitations of each of them. But again, it comes down to, what are you assessing? Are you assessing maximal dynamic strength, or are you assessing reactive strength? How are you able to assess sprinting and change direction performance? Because these are all different strength characteristics.
Yeah. Yeah. I just have never been more excited for a book. I don't know if I've said that enough times yet, but I'm just really looking forward to cracking this thing open.
Me too.
Have you been? I know that I'm sure you've seen a million like digital mock-ups. Do they put together like a paper one for you to play with ahead of time at all, or do you just?
I don't have a hard copy anything. I have digital mock-ups that I've gone through. Obviously, there's the looking at the art and whatnot that's in it, and making sure that that's visually the way that I want it, and all of that. But a lot of steps in the process, no doubt.
Okay, so let's talk real quick. It's taking my brain's just churning on testing right now. So let's take a minute just to talk about um we kind of have like a couple domains for why we would want to test, right? Like we'd want to test to see how well our programming is going, like if we're having any impact. We'd want to test to see, you talked earlier about your domains are, what are the demands of the sport and where's the athlete at, right? So it might be it's a useful tool to see like how do we line up our plan with where we want our athlete to be in the future. Um, and then, of course, we test for competitions and fun and all kinds of other reasons that we would test for. Um, can you kind of walk us through like if you picked up a sport, should we pick a new sport, bobsledding? I don't know. You can pick a sport if you don't like bobsledding. But
tell us every test you need to do for effective bobsledding.
Yeah. So, what is your paradigm like for, using testing as part of training your athletes and then revisiting your outcomes and planning for your next round,
No, I mean, obviously, it all starts with a needs analysis. Going back to what we were talking about, what do they need? What characteristics do the athletes have that make them successful? Obviously, like this book wasn't focused on the psychology piece, so obviously you can test a number of things with that. There's wellness questionnaires and all of that as well. But when it comes to the monitoring side of things, the first thing it has to be is consistent. I want it to be consistent enough where it becomes a part of the athlete's daily routine or weekly routine, etc., so that it essentially becomes invisible monitoring. When we train athletes in the weight room, we're monitoring. We're not just, when I say monitoring, we're not talking about like technique. We're obviously interested in what their technique is, but we're monitoring what they're doing with their loads. Are they increasing? Are they maintaining? Are they dropping? If we are using like a VBT device to track bar velocity, like what does that bar velocity tell us? Now, I don't want to go down that path because there's a lot of things to talk about that, and we'll talk about
we
that
talked
in the
about
next
it quite
chapter.
a bit last time, so.
Yeah. But just as an example, since we're talking about strength characteristics, one of the things that I highlight in there is if we are assessing how much load someone is moving, we're not necessarily assessing what they look like when they move that load, nor are we actually measuring how much force and how they're producing that force during the movement. So one of the things I actually had one of my grad students do, bless his heart, you can get grad students do a lot of things, but I actually had him do a 1RM on a force plate. So, because I wanted to know, what does your estimated, 90% look like? What does a successful 1RM attempt look like? But then what does a failure rep look like? And oftentimes when we see an output of something like a velocity device, it tells us, okay, they achieved this velocity. But my question is, how did they achieve that velocity? How did they move the bar? How did they lower it? How did they stand up with it? I obviously can see what they're doing. As a coach, we have our coaching eye and everything. And, some people are using 3D kinematics. I know, for example, like Christoph Kipp with Marquette was actually just with the USA weightlifting team, and they have their 3D analysis and everything that's markerless. So, but in the past, he also had them do these things on force plates, so you can actually see how they're producing force. And when you can combine those methods, you can actually assess not only did you make this lift, here's why you made this lift, and here's what we might be able to do to make it even better. But one of the things that it comes down to is the characteristics of strength. you have to assess those differently. So again, the needs analysis, what do they need? If I need maximal dynamic strength, okay, what can I measure? I can measure 1 RM. In theory, I can measure a velocity. I might, if I have the technology, maybe I can look at their force characteristics during that. But if we take your example of a bobsled athlete, I obviously want to know isometrically how much force they can produce over a short period of time, because when they hit that sled initially, it doesn't want to move. So we have to be able to develop a lot of force very quickly. So, and I learned this at East Tennessee State, because they have they're actually a site, at least they have been in the past, for USA bobsled and skeleton. So we would have athletes come through there, and we would test some of those athletes doing isometric testing. And, we'd be able to really assess, force production at 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, and how that again relates to the transfer to some of their tasks. But then we would, it makes sense for them. Brad DeWeese says it, that bobsledders are essentially just big sprinters, and they are. But obviously with the caveat that they're doing it on ice. So being able, I have like cool runnings in my head right now. Ice, but then we have to assess their sprinting. When we're assessing their sprinting, obviously you can use things like timing gates and all of that, so we can look at splits. But again, what do they look like when they're doing this? And can you assess, are there things that we need to work on in step 3, in step 5, and, et cetera, to be able to help them, depending on the position that they are. Are they the driver, left side, right side, brakeman? So, or are they doing a 2-person sled? So, then there's general strength characteristics when it comes to eccentric and concentric. Most common test is going to be a counter movement jump. So if that's the case, we can use a counter movement jump. Some teams do it differently. Being able to rock into that push is something that some of them do, which is essentially a counter movement. Some of them like to be pressed up against it and then just go from that position. That's a squat jump. So we can assess all of these different things, but we can also assess it from a different load standpoint. What percentage of their body weight or an absolute load can I add to you to be able to mimic those types of characteristics? So we are not trying to test the sport. We are testing characteristics that then translate to that sport.
Yeah. Which again requires you being not having a lot of biases about what you think about your sport, and looking at it, and figuring out what it really is, right?
Well, and the other caveat I'll add to this is that, if you do a counter movement jump, you get hundreds of variables, or you can get hundreds of variables. But the reality is a lot of those variables tell you the exact same thing. So an example is, some people don't know this. I never took a physics class. I've taken biomechanics, which is essentially physics for the body, but I did a lot of learning from some of my colleagues from, Chris Soule, Satoshi Mizuguchi, as well as John McMahon, with around the counter movement jump. So example, and Jason Lake, if you have jump height, takeoff velocity, and net propulsive impulse, they tell you the same thing, because net propulsive impulse divided by the individual's body weight or the system weight is takeoff velocity. Takeoff velocity is used to calculate jump height.
Right.
They're all the same thing.
Right.
So when we report multiple variables like that, we need to really understand what we're looking at and what does it actually tell us about the athlete. The other one that drives me nuts is, we don't see it as much anymore, is rate of power development. Power is a work rate. So we would be reporting a rate of a rate.
Right.
Yeah. For the physics fans out there, that's called the jerk.
Yeah. Rate of force development divided by time again is jerk.
Yeah. That's I mean, but like the first statement that you made is actually pretty, like, as a coach, that becomes kind of a forgiving thing, right? Because if you got a little bit of time to think about it, or if you've got a good resource that explains what the differences are, it might make it a lot easier for you to find a test that you can accommodate in your environment, right? Because there's a lot of different ways that you can skin that cat, right, for finding something that you need,
Well, and I jump height is great. It tells you an outcome. It tells you what an individual achieved. But for me, it's more important to understand how they achieved that.
Mm-hmm. And you see that in jumpers, right? Like, some jumpers will sit all the way down on their ankles to make a big jump, and other jumpers will bend at the hip, 30 degrees, and their knees don't hardly do anything. And it's like,
right,
and identical outcomes, So, yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Next chapter?
Chapter 10 is monitoring and adjusting training loads. So what this chapter does is it highlights different methods that we can use for loading. So everything from using the common term is linear periodization. There's no such thing as linear periodization, first of all. By definition, linear or periodization cannot be linear. It is linear programming. So linear programming simply refers to the idea that we add load, add load, add load, add load. It is linear. There is a line there. So some people are going to get mad at me for saying that. I can tell you that right now. But in addition to linear programming, I'm saying it now, but we talk about rep max zones. We talk about percentage of 1RM, set repetition best, APRE, the auto-regulatory progressive resistive exercise, as well as velocity-based training. We talk about RPE, as well as repetitions in reserve. So all of these things are something that I write about in this chapter. I wrote a review article with Sophia Nymphius, Mike Stone, Guy Hornsby on this topic, and one of the things that I highlight in the book is that all of these methods can be used to load our individuals, but it's really important to understand the benefits and limitations of each of them. All of them can be used, and all my students, I try to tell them that you should be able to use every single one of these, obviously equipment dependent, depending on what you have available to you, because they all have a time and a place. But in addition to that, I would also say that what are you actually measuring with that? Are you percentage of 1RM, for example? Our 1RM on a daily basis is a moving target. It's based on our physiological, our status that we currently have. So that being said, we also, it benefits you to be able to program a range of loads rather than saying you will do 80% today. We have the situation where if I have an athlete that just broke up with their significant other, I'm going to get one of two responses. I'm either going to have a really bad day or I'm going to have a really good day. Yeah, so they're just going to destroy everything. But being able to provide them with a range, but also if we go back to RM zones where you have, I always see this in the literature and I don't really understand how it's possible. They are doing 3 sets of 5 RM. And I'm like, so they're training to failure 3 times, is what you're telling me. But if they're using that 5 RM load, you're telling me that they can, like a 5 RM, when you test it, you do it 1 time.
Yeah.
You don't do it 3 times.
Yeah.
Unless you got a half hour in between sets, maybe.
Exactly, right? Yeah. So with that in mind, there's limitations to using something like that. Now, if we get into like RPE and RIR, these are subjective methods. you can use these, but you can use them in addition to some of the more objective methods of your percentage of 1RM. So if I have my percent 1RM, here's your load, then ask the athlete, how was that for you? Now we have a general idea of here's what I want you to do. Here's what you're telling me that you're capable of. So then you have the auto-regulation piece in there in terms of adjusting and monitoring those loads. But the last piece that we talk about in that chapter is the motor learning and skill acquisition part of it, in terms of how would you test and or monitor the motor learning piece of the resistance training.
Yeah. I've always been a big auto regulation person. But it's often been to my detriment because I'm a crazy person who thinks that I can always do one more rep, right? I've seen in the past, and I wish I could remember who did the study now. I hope it's not like one of yours. That would be embarrassing. But I've seen in the past they did a study where they asked people, like, what's your 10 rep max on bench press? And then they had them come into the lab, and like on average, they could do like 14 with whatever weight that they assumed was their 10 rep max. But when they were actually, being coached and in an environment where they're supervised and encouraged and stuff, they could actually do much more than they thought they could do. Are there like, I mean, obviously there's with the auto regulation, there's the obvious pitfalls of people underestimating themselves or just being psychotic and not caring whether or not they live or die on the next squat. Are there pitfalls associated with those that like you think like this is a really, I met my athlete, we're going to pivot, like, does that happen often,
Well, yeah, and I think there's certain methods that are more appropriate for the novice and more appropriate for the advanced individual, because you generally aren't going to program, RPE, RIR for a beginner, because they don't necessarily know what hard is. And I make that comment because, I've actually had this situation with a couple of the athletes that I worked with, where if we were in a high volume training session and I'm asking them their RIR after their set, and some of them would be like, oh no, I couldn't do any more. And so it gets to the point where they would have done the 10 reps that I asked them to do, and I'll be like, I'll end up like DJ Khaled, be like, another one, another one.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I will bring in, like in that situation, I need them to understand what they're capable of,
right,
before I can actually get them to understand like what is maximal. It's kind of like, I worked with a volleyball coach in the past that liked to do some timed like body weight exercises and things like that. And at the time I was there to help them run through it and was recording RPE afterwards, and for session RPE. And one of the girls disappeared for a while, and turns out she ended up going downstairs like throwing up, and then she came back. And I asked her what her RPE was that day, and she said 8. I said, no, that's a 10.
Yeah,
when you like, that is maximal max exertion.
Yeah, you had
So,
to stop. You didn't have any choice.
But it's those types of things that until someone experiences what a maximal or near maximal effort feels like, or when it comes to a lift like that, the oh shit moment, like I may not be able to stand up with this or press this above me or anything, your body starts to do some interesting things. But until someone understands that, it may not be appropriate to actually use RPE and RIR.
Yeah, just given like strict, not only you talked about like how people come in, if we're given 80%, like it's like a set of 5 at 80%, not only did like today affect what that's going to be, but also like with how new the lifter is and how far away the max was, like that 80% is going to really rapidly change in a newbie, where like yours might stay dialed in for the whole macro cycle, right? So I kind of try, like if we're doing percentage based, I try to also tell the kids like, this is if your max is still the same, like there might be some reps or sets where you really feel good, like that's okay. Like if I said 5 reps at this weight and you're feeling awesome, like don't feel bad pushing a couple out, like go ahead and go up, so, or on the next set go up a little bit of weight. Now, with high school boys especially, that gets a little dangerous because they'll be like, I felt good, and then they'll fail. They'll do like a set of 1, and it's like, what the hell was that? And he's like, oh, just my last set felt good, so I went up by 50. Well, that's not what I'm saying, bud. Like,
yeah.
Just set a new PR in the middle of a workout in the middle of the week. All right, cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
but
all right, 11.
11 is nutritional considerations for muscular strength. So, as you can imagine, this is a chapter on a variety of different things, but we have macros, micros, antioxidants, hydration, ergogenic aids, where we're talking about a lot of these supplements.
Creatine, caffeine.
Creatine certainly has its place in there. And I talk about sodium bicarbonate as well as beta alanine and caffeine. But then we get into the periodization of nutrition, but also how we can monitor nutrition for muscular strength. I do have to give a shout out to Dr. Katie Hirsch. I wrote the chapter, and she was kind enough to look through it and help me. She understands it way better than I do, and she certainly gave a thorough read through and offered some feedback on that. And I already told her she's got a shout out in the book, but I want to give her a shout out here because I really do appreciate her insight on that.
Yeah. I mean, nutrition's its whole own field, right? Like all the it depends that we've got in the strength world. There's a million.
And it's just as new and growing just as fast.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I tell people that I went to school to be a dietitian, and that was 10 years ago. And like when I hear people talk about what they're learning now, it's like, oh shit. Like,
I gotta crack a
That
book.
is very different than what we just learned. Like 10 years is a long time, but it's not that long to be.
I remember when I was, my brother is 4 years older than I am. So when he was in high school, he was taking creatine, and one of the big things back, and so he graduated in 2002. So he, when he was taking creatine, the big thing is like, oh, it could damage your kidneys and, all of this. And now, you read about the research and everything that's out there. Katie's doing a lot of it. Abby Smith Ryan is probably one of the leading researchers when it comes to all that right now. And I know she speaks on it quite a bit, but it's almost at the point, it's like, why wouldn't you be taking it?
There's
with all
very
the
intelligent
benefits?
people that, like, I'm starting to hear just everybody.
Right.
Just get on it.
Even if you're not training.
Yeah, just every human, it's just gonna help. Which is it is different. Which is funny because 2002 is we talk about this all the time. Like GMC was still selling pro hormones, like D-bol.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's like, don't take that creatine, but this pro hormone, Europe is gonna be awesome. So yeah, supplements.
Supplements are crazy. That's something. I mean, this would be like a whole other episode spent talking about supplements. But I don't know if there's any. It seems to me like there's 4 or 5 or 6, maybe 7 or 8 supplements that kind of like show up as this is good or this is conditionally good, and then everything else is kind of like you can get it if you want to, but you're spending your money on it. Was that kind of the takeaway that you got from going through that section? Because we know the ones, sodium bicarbonate buffers, like acidity in the body, you do a little more work, right? Creatine is it's the the actual thing that your cells are using for energy, and so you can produce a little more power, do a little more work in a run, right? And what's the other one you mentioned? Beta alanine, nitric oxide agonist, and so you get a little better blood flow and everything. But so there's those ones that we know that we hear all the time. Was there any surprises to you when you did the supplement section? Was there something that you were like, I'm 100% on CoQ10, and then you got in and started really getting into it? And you were
like you said, this podcast could have its own episode just on nutritional considerations for strength, but I focused on a lot of the big ones that people touch on all the time in terms of your creatine, beta alanine, caffeine, stuff that we read about all the time. I didn't want to get too far into the weeds because I am not the expert when it comes to nutrition, but at the same exact time, if these are all things that that athletes are going to be using, I again stuck with the ones that are probably used most commonly.
Yeah, so it's just it's a responsibility, right? You're gonna just provide some good basic information and
yeah, I mean, there's 30 years ago there was very smart, there was the Tims of the world may have been on the podcast of the day, a magazine, I guess, a newspaper, saying like creatine is all these bad things, and it's just because it was under research. So I totally understand that, like going and putting your name out there on stuff that you're not actually studying yourself. You're just relying on some of the research, and
Well,
then you put your
and,
name
and
there.
honestly, that was one of the big reasons why I reached out to Katie,
Right.
because Katie is the expert. Abby, she is, they are the experts, and these are the individuals that I trust, to provide the best information as well for individuals who are, albeit ignorant to some of that research, because they have their focus, but maybe they would come to me for other things.
Right.
It's very nice to be able to have that collaborative atmosphere, and to have the people you trust to be able to do that, which was not uncommon with chapter 12.
But before we get there, first off,
Yeah.
I'm hoping chapter 12 is just like something really weird, just like totally not following.
yeah, he's gonna get to the end of it.
Like
And he's
shirts,
gonna be like,
what shirts should you wear?
yeah.
Yeah.
Why I love goats, like just
They're the best animal. But the one thing I was just gonna say that I appreciate, the more intelligent of the people we talk to, it's just amazing how just the most intelligent people that we talk to are so cautious with like giving advice outside of their realm. Like I'm sure, like yes, like nutrition is not your study, but like just having been in coaching and sports, like I'm sure that a hell of a lot more than just like an average person. But then it's funny, like an uneducated person, how much they know about everything. It's just like, just saying.
It is there's a lot of very critical research around the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, but the idea that you get super confident with a little bit of knowledge and then you start to realize like, oh shit, there's a lot more to this than I know, and then eventually your confidence rises again. It does seem to be a, however you slice that cake, it does seem to be a somewhat real phenomenon.
It certainly is. The last thing I want to do is be caught on what we call Mount Stupid. I could bullshit you the entire way through nutrition and have you believe something that's not actually true. But at the same exact time, why would I do that when I know that when I can offer you resources that will give you better answers than I can?
Yeah, unfortunately, right now with the fact that clicks and likes can equal paychecks, and sometimes if you're big enough, paychecks that are gonna outpace anything that you could do with your actual education in a lot of time. You get kind of weird advice.
I'm gonna start doing it.
Wrong advice. You know what I mean? Because you're gonna get all the people that are clicking in because it's like, well, that's stupid ass advice. Let me click on that and comment how stupid this is. But it's like, well, you're just getting them paid.
Yeah.
And then they have a lot of credentials. So it's kind of a crazy space.
Yeah.
So just listen, and it's hard because you can't say I was just going to say listen to the experts, but a lot of those people are. I mean, they have PhDs or they're at a university, so it's tough.
Well,
Yeah.
and the one thing I'll say about that is don't be afraid to ask the question, because a lot of times I think COVID made it worse because everyone was wearing masks, and I think everyone viewed those as muzzles and they couldn't talk anymore. I would rather place a phone call to Katie or somebody else. I'll text and everything, but if I need to get something like really across, I'll be like, hey, can we schedule a video call? Can we do or can we have a phone call just because I want clarification on certain things? I'll call up Paul Comfort, and he's in the UK and everything, but we'll have regular calls just to bounce ideas off of each other as well. So but yeah, especially if I'm not confident on a topic, or even when I'm putting together a presentation, I just need feedback. I'll just say, how does this look? Like, how do you view this would actually come across? Trust me, I love showing some of the presentation stuff to my wife Sometimes sometimes, because she's in the field as well, but she can also be critical critical in the way that I need her to be critical,
Right.
because she will look at it and say, I don't know what this means. I'm a strength and conditioning coach, and this doesn't tell me anything. The most classic example was when I wrote the word paucity in a paper, and I believe the direct quote was, "What the crap is this word?" So, I love her, and she is bluntly honest, and that's the best part of some of the things that she reviews for me. It can be frustrating, but it makes it better in the end.
It is nice to have somebody that is close to you, but also is in the field, because, like you said, like somebody in a position of power, whether that's just a coach or whether that's a professor, you can probably convince a lot of people. Because and most of the time, like as an athlete or a client or a student, like most of the time, if that's a good relationship, like I want you to like me, right? I want this relationship, so you can, in the position of power, convince a lot of people of some stupid crap, or to do stupid things, or to believe stupid things. So it's probably a good idea to be appropriate with our, knowledge giving, and other things.
Yeah, it's okay to
What you're telling me is I can just teach students something an entire semester, and then at the very end be like, everything I just told you was a lie.
I mean, that would be pretty messed up.
It would, and that's why I would never do it.
I was trying to say that I just wanted you to like me. That's what I was trying to.
that's the part you wanted to get out of that. Yeah. Don't, like, if you work with somebody who's like afraid to be wrong or afraid to not know, like that's kind of a red flag, right? Because it's okay to not know stuff, and it's okay to be wrong, and that's part of the game.
Yeah, I try my best, but I assume that I'm messing up. There's portions that I'm screwing up, but so I just try to always keep learning, and I go like, oh.
Well, and we've talked about it a bunch of times already, like in the, if you do this for a long time, there's going to be something that you think is awesome and super effective, and there's research for it and people who've done it, and then they're going to come out, 5 years later, 10 years later, they're going to be like, it's not that it's a terrible thing to do, it's just that it's a version of this other thing, and this other thing is probably what you want to be doing, right? Like that happens all the time as we refine how we understand, the body works and training works and all that kind of stuff. So whatever you fall in love with, it's probably going to be wrong at some point, and you're going to have to revisit it. Okay, 12.
It is not my favorite. It's not t-shirts. I apologize.
The glossary.
It is recovery considerations for strength.
I'm actually really interested in this.
It's at the end.
Yeah.
So, after you read all this, you might need to recover. But as you can imagine, this is going to provide a breakdown of essentially every method I could find when it comes to recovery. So, obviously, we have an entire chapter related to nutrition. We touch on that briefly in chapter 12 again, but obviously, we talk about the recovery side of our macros in chapter 11, but sleep is a massive component to it. And of the two things that we know that work for sure when it comes to recovery, sleep and nutrition. Those are the main things. It's not to say that other things can't work, but we also have to consider the periodization of recovery, which I do touch on in this chapter as well. So, as you can imagine, the recovery methods that we have are everything from sleep, nutrition, cold tubs, hot tubs, saunas, massage, compression garments. What else? Lasers, I mean, you name it, ultrasound, so all these different methods that are in here, active recovery, these types of things. So, but the first thing that we actually go through and identify is what is recovery and what is fatigue. Dr. Bill Sands does a really good job in terms of highlighting in previous book chapters, like, we don't actually know what recovery is, but here's what, the definition of recovery in our book is essentially a return to baseline of force production from your previous state. And, that's very loose because strength is obviously a spectrum. But so whether that is reactive strength or maximal strength, that's another caveat in itself. But we talk about the mental fatigue and recovery side of that, the placebo effect when it comes to recovery, but also periodization of recovery and how we may actually be able to measure recovery.
Right.
Go ahead.
Before you have a better memory than I do. I got to get mine out right away.
I'll just draw a wiggle.
Yeah. So the one thing you said in there, which was important, I think, to talk about, I feel like we've talked about it before, was like recovery of strength, but like also recovery of fatigue. Like you could be like, it was your 15 for 15, right? You probably were physically recovered, but you were not mentally recovered for a long time.
Yeah, I literally couldn't squat for weeks.
Yeah. So like that, you got to also take into account, like sometimes when we'll talk about like deloads and stuff, like the kids are like, I'm good. Right. And it's like, all right, but I'm going to push you again, like to the end of the trimester. Like I need you. I get it that you probably could squat, but I don't want you to have squatted heavy for 12 straight weeks. Like you're just going to be mentally fatigued by the end of that. And I need you peaked out at the end, not right now. So like really thinking about that. And again, it depends, the title, but that's like a big thing is thinking about how long can you actually push, like pay attention to that, understand yourself, like before you start to get the feelings of like, oh, I don't want to go to the gym.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I don't know, I mean, if I had 25 minutes of questions, would I be abusing your time? Like what time do you need to get out of here? I didn't ask you before we got started.
I mean, we've been going close to 2 hours at this point.
Yeah. Maybe we'll try to keep it under the 2 hour. So you
Part three.
Yeah. I'll try not to get crazy about it then. This is one of like the pet passions that I've had ever since I first discovered that stimulus recovery adaptation model. So if I remember correctly, if you're in the space, you've probably seen the graph before. You work out, your performance goes down, it comes back up as you recover, and then you adapt and you can do cooler stuff. It's a really simple line. If I remember correctly, it was based on research where they poisoned rats in like the 50s or the 30s or something. And it was just kind of like, hey, look, our body adapts to things. And then we just kind of ran with it. But those curves, those stimulus and, loss of function and recovery and adaptation curves, there's a lot of them in your body. There's not one curve for you as a whole creature. And so when you get into the idea of like what is recovery, it's like, okay, well, is that when all of my little strains and sprains have all fixed themselves? Is that when my inflammation cycle has ended? Is that when I get back to performing? Is that when I feel good and I'm excited to be working out again? Like there's literally dozens and dozens and dozens of systems in your body that go through that kind of cycle. And so it's recovery is like a really, really, really fascinating thing to me that I would very much I'll talk about it for 17 hours because it might be the most interesting thing to me right now in training, which I think might be a weird thing to be the most interesting thing.
Well, I would tell anyone listening, and again, I'll give her a shout out as I did in the book. But another person who helped me out with this chapter was Dr. Shona Halson. I call her the Royal of Recovery because when it comes to all the recovery methods that out there, she is on everything. And I kind of joked about that with her. I said I couldn't find an article that you weren't on. But all jokes aside, a lot of what she does is generally based on sleep and sleep hygiene. She does great work, and I would anyone interested in recovery should check her stuff out.
Cool. Okay, so my one technical question, if that's okay, if I'm not abusing your time, is just can you describe a little bit the periodization of recovery? Because that kind of is, in line with like the things like when I saw that curve, and then I was like, well, bones don't remodel like tendons remodel, like ligaments remodel, like muscle remodels, like fascia remodels, like skin remodels. Like they all have their own steps, right? So, can you talk a little bit about periodizing recovery?
So periodization of recovery is referring to the idea of recovery methods being used at different times.
Oh, okay.
So I call it more programming of recovery methods, but the idea, and I know Greg Hoff talks about this in his book, his recent periodization book, but one of the things that you have to do is you have to treat any recovery method as a stimulus. because you're still changing something within the body in an attempt to get it back to equilibrium. However, it is still a stress to the body, just differently. So if we take the squeezy pants, pneumatic compression pants, that is going to add a certain stimulus to your body. The idea is that we're trying to add additional blood flow, and ideally getting things into the lymph system so it can be excreted and blah blah blah. But the idea is we cannot use the same method of recovery all the time, because it's like any other training method. If I were to use foam rolling every single time, it'd be like if I'm going to squat every single session, right? So I can't use the same method all the time, because I know that it's going to recover a certain, in theory, again, it's going to help me recover a certain amount, but it's recovering from that workout to get me back to whatever stage I'm going to be at for my next workout. But the following workout, my battery may not necessarily be at 100%, but if I use the same method, if that didn't get me back to 100%, now I'm even lower. So then I may need to use something else in order to modify that. So it happens over the course of the entire season or the training year, that I need to introduce or add or remove certain methods of recovery so that my body can actually adapt the way that I want it to adapt. An example would be when it comes to hypertrophy and higher volumes of training, I may actually remove methods of recovery so that the body can actually go through the process of building the muscle architectural adaptations that I want, versus in season when I'm trying to maximize my performance. I need every method that I can get that will allow me to be at my peak when possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. I think we did it. I don't want to.
We did
forever,
it.
It was daytime when we started this. Tim looks like he's in a dark attic at this point.
In the cave right now.
Well, I hope that my enthusiasm can carry you through the rest of whatever you got to do today and the next week. We really appreciate you being here, man. It means a lot to us. So thanks so much for coming in.
Oh, again, thank you for the opportunity to be able to talk about this, and hopefully, if people are interested, again, July 3rd, the book comes out, Science and Development of Muscular Strength, and it can all be pre-ordered on Amazon.
Super excited about that.
Awesome.
All right, guys, like, comment, subscribe, share. We appreciate it a ton. Thank you so much.